Welcome everyone. My name is Stefaan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of GovLab, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this session here at the My Data conference that is focused on data collaboration in the age of COVID-19. And as we all know, COVID-19 has put data central to many conversations. I think we've never had an environment and a disaster that has been so much driven by data and informed by data. And I think by now, we probably all know the Johns Hopkins data visualization by heart. And I think it's going to probably become a central feature for the years to come. I expect that MoMA will probably have the data visualization somewhere as an icon of 2020, a visual icon of 2020. And obviously, here at GovLab, we've done a lot of work over the years on data collaboration. And so when COVID-19 really hit our shores, we really were interested also in what role will data collaboration play in actually tackling COVID-19, and how will different actors, including private sector actors, play a role in order to inform the decision-making and inform public health decisions as it relates to COVID-19. And so since then, here at GovLab, we've done a lot of work in order to understand what is really happening at the data collaborative space. And so we have done and established, I guess, the largest repository with regard to data for COVID-19, repository that documents efforts that bring different parties together in order to exchange data and in order to exchange expertise with regard to data in order to contribute to COVID-19 response and recovery activities. And so at the moment, I think we have about 211, I see, initiatives that we have documented. And among those initiatives are people that are around the table. And we thought it might be a good idea during the My Data conference to really leverage this session to take stock, to look back, what have we learned, and also how do we move into the new normal by leveraging the lessons learned from COVID-19, but also lessons learned from data collaboration for the last few years. And so that's the focus of this session. And we have a stellar group of experts, what we call data stewards, that have agreed to join us to really reflect on data collaboration at a time of COVID-19. And so I will briefly introduce everyone, and then we will dive in immediately in some of the substance and the questions that we hope to address. For those that have joined us, please indicate perhaps where you are from so that we have a sense of time zones that are around this this call. But also, if you have any questions during the session, feel free to put it in the chat, and I will then cover that during the session as well. Or we will have a Q&A also about 20 minutes before or 30 minutes before we end. With that, let me introduce Kelly Jin, who is the Chief Analytics Officer of the City of New York. We have Claudia Juech, who is the CEO of the Claudia Foundation and based in California. We have Dave Green, who is the Assistant General Counsel of Microsoft and of the Open Innovation Unit at Microsoft, and based in Washington State, Seattle. And we have JoAnn Stonier, who is the Chief Data Officer of MasterCard and based here in New York State. At least that's my understanding, JoAnn, where you are currently located. You never know during COVID-19 where people are or where they are supposed to be. Anyway, with that, let me chime in immediately and ask you all the question, which was the question that we posed early March which was that after years of working on data collaboration, now that we have a major event happening, are we ready to really leverage data collaboration as a tool to address critical public needs or address the pandemic? And I'm going to stop share my screen here so that we see everyone. And so the question I have for everyone, and perhaps starting with Kelly, because obviously you're on the front line of also informing decision making on a daily basis. Were we ready from a data point of view in March? And if not, what were the challenges that you saw, and what have we since overcome at the level of data collaboration? Over to you, to Kelly.
Sure, and thanks to Stefaan and My Data and everyone for the invite today. Coming to you all from Brooklyn, New York. I have not left the city in about 8 or 9 months. I'm very jealous of folks who are elsewhere throughout the country or throughout the world. I did not feel like we were ready. I'd be interested to hear from the other panelists, for those who did feel ready, interested to hear from those participants at organizations who felt ready in late February for us here in New York City and early March this year. There are a couple of very tangible stories about that readiness. For myself personally and my team, we were called in the very first week of March. And Stefaan, we were staring at that dashboard up on the screen and listening to regular briefings from all of the local, state and federal electeds on a daily basis. And when we walked in the door, our always mission in an emergency is to figure out where is all of the data, how do we visualize it for executives and decision makers, and that was a very manual process at the very beginning. And I think what has been really interesting to me in this context is more not around the different types of data sets, but more what is the agility, what is the skill set that it takes to actually bring together data for insights. So early on for us, personal protective equipment, PPE, N95 masks, it didn't make sense pre-March that anybody would have a database of all of that integrated it across hospitals, across city agencies. But these were some of the initial questions that we were faced. And so for me and my team, it was, how do we get up to speed very quickly? Because a data collaborative or thinking even about data integration is still for us a couple months off. How do we actually work with the data that we have? And some of these really critical questions we're getting like every couple hours from the emergency management group and from City Hall here in New York. The other big thing I think that's important to note, and I'm hopefully talking to a pretty tech and data savvy audience here, is we oftentimes we've architected these very brilliant data warehouses, like whatever terminology you want to call them, either in academic or in industry environments. All of those serve a reporting purpose that has a daily, nightly load, weekly, monthly report. These are all of our traditional BI reports. You're getting your performance measures, your CEO knows what's going on. The type of demand, Stefaan, that I felt like we got and still have today, that is, we need all of this information. We need to know the number of cases, like as it's happening. We need to know the number of people that are getting tested as quickly as possible. I didn't feel like the framework had been stood up and was ready for that. And I think also the nature of this particular emergency, where here in New York, for those of you who know, the city had to live through and recover from Hurricane Sandy. That was the emergency was kind of done. And then we segued into response. And for myself personally, I remember I used to work for DJ Patil, who helped coin the term data scientist back at the White House in 2016, which feels like a lifetime ago. I remember calling him up in those first couple weeks, and he was doing volunteer work for the state of California. And he said, Kelly, we are on the first paragraph of the first page of the book. And that kind of, for me, really put in context, even now, many, many months later on, where we are. But yeah, just wanted to expound a little bit. But my short answer is no, we were not ready. There were a lot of things that had to do with the scenarios that we were ready for, but it was not particular to the pandemic we were in the moment.
Great, thanks, thanks, Kelly. And it's very interesting also to indeed, because, and we probably can come back to that in a second, is that the demand for data and how it changes during the life cycle of the pandemic. I mean, you mentioned anyway, the need for understanding PPE at the beginning, and then anyway, then suddenly other data points were necessary down the line, and then even understanding what are the data points across the data lifecycle, I think is something that we hopefully have learned, that you do have different needs depending on the different places we are in and the different stages we are in with regard to the pandemic as well. Moving to JoAnn. I mean, JoAnn, you've been a pioneer around on data collaboration for many years. And I'm sure probably in March, many were knocking on your door with regard to, can we anyway work together? And so the same question to you, JoAnn. Of course, you are anyway in a different situation than Kelly, but even anyway from a MasterCard point of view, do you feel anyway were we ready as a society? I don't want to focus on organizations, but as a society, were we ready to really develop a data response?
Oh boy, so as a society, so I was listening to Kelly, and I like the idea of being on the first paragraph of the book. I hoped that we were a little bit further along, Kelly, in that we had been having conversations about what was needed to do multi-stakeholder sharing. And ironically, I've led conversations on this topic for a while. Worked with multilateral organizations, private sector, governments, academic institutions, civil society organizations, and we all agreed even what kind of ecosystems are necessary, all participants, and even started developing common language and some processes. And, it's interesting because it's easier to share, one organization to another, right? Node to node in an ecosystem. But then COVID happened, and even for us, where we were a network and we service a lot of customers, what I found is happening is that every organization overnight transformed into a data organization, right? Mm-hmm. There was a need for every organization to understand its own data, as well as how it fit into what I call the data value chain of its own ecosystems, so that it could survive, whether that was because they were right in the middle of the pandemic value chain, Kelly, you were, or because of its own economic value chain that they had to figure out how they're going to service their customers and or even navigate the employee question, right? So many organizations were struggling to just have connectivity for their employees to then service customers. And so too many organizations were without any playbook at all, Stefan. Mm-hmm. And so then they were relying on their partnerships, right, to try to prop them up. And I think in the early days, it was really, really difficult. I think it's improved. I mean, we can talk about then versus now. Yeah. I do think that a lot of pages of that particular parts of the book have gotten written very quickly. That every organization has woken up to the fact that they need to be more data-driven organization. They understand that they are more connected to each other and to their customers, their vendors, their suppliers, and government partners, quite frankly, than they ever been before. But that being said, I think a lot of organizations are still struggling with the basics of data, basics of infrastructure, even this far into the pandemic. And that and part of that also is that we're struggling with so many crises at the same time that the world is going to be changing as we go. And I think that the importance of collaboration is going to continue to topic, as well as all the other kinds of issues that go along with that. How do you do it in a responsible manner? How do you handle issues like data ethics and privacy and security and all these issues is going to be a topic for communities of interest to handle together. But no, I don't think we were ready. I think some organizations, even mature ones, were more ready than others and helped out. But it was a big hill to climb.
Great, thanks, JoAnn. Going to Dave, and in the same kind of question now. Of course, Dave, you've been also at the forefront of the Microsoft Open Data campaign, which really tries to establish those data collaborations worldwide. And obviously, the campaign started before COVID-19 happened, and so the same question to you. Anyway, while you had the campaign, did the campaign also envision this massive need for collaboration around data, and was Microsoft or society at large again ready to respond?
Sure. Well, thanks, Stefan, and really thanks for this really excellent panel. It's nice to be in the same company of folks that are, very deep into this space and heard these perspectives. Look, COVID was nothing that anyone could have anticipated, at least when we began our campaign. I think we began our open data campaign in part because we realized the value of data collaboration, but also for other reasons. Before COVID, as you mentioned, like we were already into a journey about how we could encourage, data sharing collaborations kind of more generally. And we had released a number, for example, of open data agreements that were focused on ways that we could accelerate the opportunities for data collaboration. That was the way that we thought we could best add value and enter the conversation. A little bit of background. Our reason for focusing on data collaboration is very mission driven. And our company's mission statement is to empower individuals and organizations to achieve more. And I think we understood that democratizing the access and the use of AI is going to be absolutely critical towards delivering on that mission statement. And being able to harness the power of AI really means having meaningful access to data beyond the data that sits in an organization's borders. And so, from that perspective, data collaboration is very much a part of our strategy to help bridge the data divide and really ensure that organizations and individuals can use AI and data to achieve more. But the timing of the COVID crisis was really interesting, kind of as you mentioned. We were kind of in the midst at that time of taking stock of like our own internal data assets prior to COVID. And it was really challenging for Microsoft to sort of help prioritize how we went about that approach. Like every organization, we generate a huge amount of data for typically discrete purposes. And so what we typically would do as part of this data inventory effort is to say, well, what data do we have that can help promote collaboration? And invariably the result we got from our business group was, well, what data do you need? And we learned, I think, because of COVID, that it really helped us be ready for data collaborations kind of at scale and speed. We're really good, and I think our teams do an excellent job of planning around the ingestion of data and around things like compliance and security measures and designing infrastructure that helps us evaluate and use data for the reason that we ingested it or created it. But we weren't so great about planning for extraction. We weren't so great about architecting for the reuse and distribution beyond the initial purpose for kind of our ingesting data. And so I think what COVID did for our thinking is, I'll give you credit, it's really what GovLabs and the Open Data Policy Lab that we've helped sponsor have been advocating. It gives us a way to be more purposeful by allowing us to align around the problems that we were trying to solve. And obviously COVID was a huge problem to solve. But knowing that that was the purpose for which we were asking the data question, that really helped us resolve the question of what data we needed in that effort. I'll give you a good example. We have the second largest search engine in the world, and we generate a huge amount of traffic and data queries around a wide variety of topics. And so often on a particular topic, we have a really good idea of the relationships of that topic to other things and to answers and things that people are giving. And so, while it would have never occurred to us that that would have value in the COVID context, one of the ways that once we decided we knew we were solving for COVID, we were able to go back to our search teams and say, hey, what information do you have that will help, for example, the CDC refine its message and understand whether the communications that they're providing are resulting in people seeking information or obtaining the correct information. So being able to go back and look at our search query data set around COVID, anonymize that, and then make that data set available. In this case, we made it as an open data set, allowed any research organization or government agency to go back and compare that and say, when we say X, does the public perceive it that way? And where do they go for additional information? So that was an example of where by aligning around a purpose, that helped us articulate and really examine, how it is that we could improve our opportunities for extraction of data and for being planful and being able to reuse data beyond the initial ingest purpose that we had.
Great. Thanks, Dave. And I saw yesterday or the day before, there was also another initiative around search data. And I'm wondering whether Microsoft is also involved in some of that, where they try to have a dashboard on queries such as lost my smell, and then and whether that is a proxy for which of course is already done in other public health environments, but whether that's a proxy for instance, an outbreak of COVID-19. And they said that, if people search for losing my smell, then it's very likely that they have COVID-19. If they say I cough, then it's might not be as likely. But is that something also that you've been looking into?
It has, and it was based upon some research, I think initial research at the University of Washington and other facilities that were able to, for example, identify outbreaks or identify clusters of outbreaks by looking at social media conversations kind of in the aggregate. And if they saw a cluster of activity in this space, it gave rise to, hey, there may be something going on here. If they could take that data and combine that with other relevant data, even if it's not social media related data, all of a sudden you've got a much sharper picture of what's going on.
Great. Claudia, you also, again, have been pioneering data collaboration, but especially in the nonprofit environment, and also by not only focusing on data, but also data capacity and expertise and other assets. And so the same question for you, Claudia, when indeed we were confronted with COVID-19, were we ready, especially within the nonprofit community, to even contemplate how to use data or use data in a way that actually mitigated some of the impact on the nonprofit community as well?
Thank you, Stefan. Great to be here. And when I listen to Dave and Kelly and JoAnn, then I feel the nonprofit community that I represent here is probably 10 years behind what you are describing, and I'm vastly generalizing here. There are definitely also outliers, but we have, since the inception of the Cloudera Foundation that I represent, which was created in 2017, we have spoken with about 300 nonprofit organizations and are working intensely with a few of those as grantees. And I mean, the capacity of organizations to manage data and the sophisticated data capabilities that I think some of you are describing are very, very rare in the nonprofit space. I think just to give an example, a lot of organizations are more focused on right now, for example, to get a 360 view of their beneficiaries. So they have different programs, those programs are siloed, and a lot of the big implementation organizations, so those are organizations that implement programs for USAID abroad, are working on basically establishing that view. So that tells you that in terms, and it has a lot to do with funding. Who are the funders out there that basically provide financial support to set up holistic data management practices and really enable these organizations to develop a data culture across the whole organization. So those are definitely drawbacks. or significant drawbacks and disadvantages that nonprofit organizations are facing. I think the second piece is that that we saw when COVID hit us and hit people around the globe, I mean, this was not the moment, because everybody was in crisis mode, for nonprofits to invent something new. And again, I'm speaking, for a lot of the existing and large organizations, but instead to think about what do they already have in place, where, for example, as part of a diagnosis protocol that is on a handheld device of a community health worker, a question on COVID-19 can be integrated. So a lot of it was really about plugging in or expanding on what already existed. And so that was, for example, what happened, and one of our grantees, Terre des Hommes, or TDH, did in Burkina Faso. Looking forward in terms of data collaborations, I think the big concern that I clearly have is, I mean, initially we saw very clearly that I think funding streams were reverted, and understandably so. Everything that's not COVID will have a harder time to receive funding, and I think we will continue to see that also into 2021 and probably 2022. And I think that will make it more challenging to really, I think the piece that I worry about, as big as an event as COVID is, are we focusing again on a specific vertical instead of really horizontally looking at how can we build data capabilities? And just to give you another example of a data collaboration and what it takes. So the partner that we have in Burkina Faso, who's implementing a digital health solution there, they had to hire a person that went around the different ministries to get access to, for example, weather data, socioeconomic data from different ministries. I mean, from our perspective, when you look at the city of New York or others, Microsoft, that might feel like a very small investment, but in the context of Burkina Faso and this nonprofit organization, that was, significant transactional costs. And again, how can we, what are the things that we could in place that would allow that going forward to really enable those data collaborations or access to public data sets sustainably and not just as a one-off. And maybe lastly, to give an example of a different type of data collaboration, one of our newest programs, the Data for Change Accelerator, where we onboard a cohort of organizations. The first one will mainly focus on issues of racial equity. We have selected 5 organizations that have, over a 6 months period, work on their individual data problems, and will likely not necessarily share data, but share experience and peer learning. And that could be another aspect of kind of collaborating around data.
Great. And thanks, Claudia, for moving the conversation towards the real question that I hope we can address in the rest of the conversation here is how do we, given the fact that we've spent years on working on data collaboration, and then we realized that actually we still need to build a lot of the infrastructure, both the human infrastructure, the policy infrastructure, and the technical infrastructure, to really make data collaboration more systematic, sustainable, and responsible. Because I think that's really the task ahead. And I think the lesson learned from both COVID-19, but also from other efforts is how do we go beyond the one-offs, or how do we make this more sustainable so that it's not always an afterthought or even in some cases driven by disasters, that it actually is something that you are ready to do no matter what. And how do we do it also in a responsible way, right? And so that's what I would like to focus on next, is how do we do this systematically, sustainably, and responsibly. And let's focus first on the systematic aspect of data collaboration. And particularly, Kelly, one of the elements that we feel is quite often lacking in order to do this systematically is to have actually a really, which actually Dave also alluded to, is to have a really clear demand for data, or even a coordinated demand for data, so that you actually know these are the areas that matter, that we should develop data collaborations for, as opposed to everything goes, right? And so question to you, Kelly, is how can we coordinate and solicit demand, for instance, within New York and elsewhere, in a more systematic way, so that there is a clear signal for where we need data collaboration for?
Well, for us, we are, this is a very biased answer. New York City is lucky enough to have a mayor's office of data analytics that predates me, the role, the function, the staffing, the budget that exists. And so, Stefaan, early on in March, our demand and that centralization was the fact that you had dozens and dozens of offices that all knew that we existed inside of the city. They came to us, they emailed me, they still email me to today, saying these are our data needs. And we also have a public facing aspect through our work. So David, we work on open data here within New York City. My team helps to lead that up. A lot of our civic engagement, certainly working with GovLab and Stefaan, a lot of that is based around open data. And so we have this presence that I think is pretty functionally unique, and I'm not sure if that's replicated. I know there are many, many other municipal data offices throughout the country, but what is a small data office that both talks to the public, private sector companies, academic institutions, and oh, hey, they also talk to all of your internal agencies for a city as large as New York. And so when a lot of these questions came up around what are the data sets that we need, which here in New York City, just to give everyone a sense, if you don't know, we have, depending on how you count, probably 100 plus different agencies. Each of those agencies sharing data internally is just as complicated as different companies trying to share data with one another. And so here we are, a small team of 10, trying to serve as a translator and facilitator. And I feel like, Stefaan, that was a lot of our value add, and continues to be a lot of our value add to make these connection points. And one thing I want to bring up, and I haven't highlighted it yet, was that for us early on in, I want to say middle of April, we kind of picked our heads up a little bit post immediate response, was that we were getting a lot of incoming questions from agencies saying, we're not able to actually get what we need from internal government data. What data is out there? And this has always been the case, right? But the actual need to understand how small businesses are doing, how people are moving throughout New York City and moving kind of into the city and the state versus other cities and states. These are very big questions. The government doesn't collect this data and information. And so we were really lucky. We started a program called the Recovery Data Partnership here. It took us a couple months, but I felt like it was pretty fast. We launched it in July with, at this point, we're up to 13 different partners, and literally was calling people saying, would this be interesting to you? You're so-and-so agency. We have interest from Kinza, and they're the digital thermometer company. We have interest from Zillow to help support around economic sector, housing sector data. Would this unfortunately, my answer is not a great one, where when it comes to the systematic approach, actually having an office, it doesn't have to be called the data office, but someone that people know internally facing and externally facing can be someone to speak to. And that office doing a lot of this connection, I think, has been really helpful. And for us, when we started, we were like, if we build it, they will come. And very quickly, we had all these different data sets, these different partners, and very quickly, economic sector data, mobility data, health data. These are the big three. I have a lot of agencies constantly knocking on the door those are the data sets that they have used to inform their agency's analysis. So again, we were lucky because we are New York City. We like picked up the phone and called a bunch of people. They called us, but having that investment in people and systems, I think, is a pretty big one around standing up offices and government environments.
Great, and again, thanks, JoAnn, for setting up my next question to JoAnn, Kelly, for my next question to JoAnn. That's where I wanted to go, which is, as you mentioned, I think it's very important to actually have those translators, or even what we call data stewards, people that have a function to think about how can data help, but also a function to think about what's the value of our data for other purposes beyond the purpose that it was collected. And would be, before we go to JoAnn, it would be interesting, Kelly, because we get quite often asked by people, so who should we talk to in corporation X? And of course, anyway, if it's MasterCard, then we know, and if it's Microsoft, we know. But in most cases, I have to say to them, good luck finding out, right? Because there is no real organized function within many organizations that actually play that translator role or can be the point of contact with the outside world around their data. So a question to you, Kelly, before we go to JoAnn, because JoAnn, of course, has figured this out, is what was your experience with actually knocking on doors of corporations on how easy was it to identify the right person to talk to?
It was very easy for those organizations. I knew people at those organizations because I just went to them and they connected me to the right folks. Stefan, you're absolutely right. There are a lot of very large companies that we spoke with. I don't think we ever found someone. I think I tried like tweeting at people. There were like many different tactics that we ended up taking. And I don't think I have necessarily any deep insights there other than the actual aha moments were when we actually connected with someone at organizations and companies that understood both, someone who understood data, policy, and legal. So when we talked to the lawyers, they were like, we don't exactly understand what's happening here. And we talked to the technical people, they're like, yeah, this sounds great. We'll just give you all the data. It was finding the right skill set. And I actually think it's a mirrored skill set of what we have within the mayor's office of data analytics. You need someone who can kind of understand all these various pieces of the work that we're trying to do. And certainly even terms, right? Like when we talk about data collaboration and a lot of what is colloquial to us, how do we find those like-minded folks across different organizations is something, yeah, I continue to grapple with.
Great. So JoAnn, that was the question: is how do you, how do you, as MasterCard, and also anyway, of course, the private sector, how do you organize yourself in order to be able to respond to solicitation in a manner that is sustainable and systematic as well? Because that's quite often the real challenge, and you're probably one of the persons that have that has done the thinking the longest about that, and so eager to get your sense as well.
It's so interesting because I'm really been the chief data officer since 2018, but I was the privacy officer before then, and I've done information governance since like 2016. So I guess I have, but it's so interesting to hear that I've done it so long when in fact there's been plenty of other people who've done it longer than me. But I do think it's really important to know when you're in private sector, somebody really needs to understand what your data is good for, right? And somebody needs to be, to Kelly's point, somebody needs to also be the person that understands what's in bounds and what's out of bounds with your data. And we're a financial services company, we're a technology company, but we also are a regulated company, right? And healthcare is also regulated. And so yes, it's lovely to have technologists who might say, oh yeah, sure, have all our data, but there's some issues that you have to handle delicately, and you can't share all the data, right? You can share insights, right? You can share derivations of data, you can share information, but you can't share raw data. And especially if you're a global company like mine, there's a whole bunch of issues that you really need to understand. We talk about data collaboration, we're really not talking about raw data sharing. will never give you any of these card number and card information. So all of your MasterCard charges and credits and debits are all safe. Let me just say that to everybody out there. We do not share that information with anybody other than the bank to who it pertains to get it up back to your card statement. But you know, there is information we can share, econometric information that our data is good for and can be helpful to understanding. Oftentimes in emergency response, right? It is helpful to know what merchants are open and closed, right? As the pandemic was overtaking different cities and locations, that was one of the data points that was really helpful, right? That individuals needed to know where can I get gas, right? Where are things open and where are things shut? And it was important for first responders, ambulance drivers, et cetera. And so Kelly and Stefaan are right that, you know, it is important that there is one point of contact, but, you know, data is the lifeblood of some organizations, right? And I think Kelly's point that it is hard to find those skill sets, right? I talk about when I find talent for my team, I need right brain, left brain folk, right? People who understand data analytics, who can walk through with a data scientist and go really deep on how an algorithm is structured, but just importantly, can think through the use case and understand what are the reputational issues of sharing our data, using our data in a given context, especially if it's a new area that we're going to be going into. Certainly the pandemic, everybody was focused on trying to figure out how do we assist given the light of new circumstances, with so many different sectors, so many different customers. You know, in the beginning, there was a million ideas on tracking health data, right? Were you positive? Were you negative? Could you, right? We're approached with a million things because our POS systems, phone tracking, right? You know, could we use our information, be of assistance with that? And we explored a million of those ideas, and some of them we participated in, and some of them we said, you know, no, not for us. But without that one point of contact, which then reaches deep back into an organization. So I certainly don't want to say my team does this alone, but without that point of contact to also, you know, my general counsel, my CEO, my CFO, who's our risk officer, you know, they say I have a red card that I also get to play to say no, because somebody also has to say no sometimes. And I think that's really important for private enterprise. Because sometimes we can't say yes, right? We have shareholders and we have customers who have entrusted data to us. But at the same time, MasterCard, like Microsoft, we have a deep commitment to use our data for positive social impact. And we want to, you know, use our data for positive purposes. And certainly, if you're motivated that way, you also want people who are coming to you. And I have a whole Center for Financial Inclusion that will come to me and say, can we use our data for these purposes? So that's also pretty exciting. But without the expertise that my team and I have, I think it'd be really difficult to further that goal. I do. And so having that expertise and having it ahead of time, a whole lot easier than trying to set that up in the middle of a pandemic, I'm sure.
Dave, any reactions from your end? And then also adding a question which anyway is quite often asked as well is, so how do you do this sustainably from a business point of view, i.e. what's the incentive to even, anyway, clearly there's a corporate social responsibility incentive, but also how do you do this in a way that is sustainable over time?
Yeah, and I think that's the right way to ask that question, because look, COVID is an unprecedented situation. And I think with this collective sense that we're all in this together, like everyone's doing what we can. It's, you know, it's very similar to like wartime or disaster time or what have you, where you just pitch in where you can. But after the, you know, after the event is over and as we return to whatever our regularly scheduled lives are supposed to be post-COVID, I think that is the question. I would say that, you know, if you approach the task of building a case, a business case, for example, around data philanthropy, or even if it's just a business driven like data collaboration, the discipline and the approach is similar and it's different than typical business case scenarios. And I mentioned business case scenarios because if you're going to go into an organization, particularly one like Microsoft that has, it's effectively many different businesses, you know, the first question I think that is on the minds of folks is, okay, like, why are we doing this? What's the business case? Why should I prioritize this effort over the thousands of other projects that, you know, are also have merit and are looking for for resources. I've already talked about sort of our broader corporate mission. So, that's obviously, I would phrase that as not just data philanthropy. I would say that it's existential to a company like Microsoft, about how we foster learning ourselves and how we foster learning in an environment amongst our customers about how to do data collaborations. And what I usually tell our internal folks is, this can't just be a fiscally focused exercise on return on investment. And that's not to say that every collaboration is only about data philanthropy. I mean, we've got perfect examples of where we're engaging with customers or collaborators to develop AI models or to just improve our customers' products or services. And in those cases, you typically would bring a traditional business case scenario. But I think that always thinking about data collaboration using a typical ROI approach is really the wrong way to think about the value of data collaboration. I'll give you a couple of examples. Whether or not the business case or incentives are amorphous or just really aspirational, or whether they're very particular, this is the benefit that we hope to obtain. I don't think in many cases that data collaboration really reveals its true value until either after or during the actual example. And I'll give you one particular example. We were involved with the Alan Turing Institute, who was working with the City of London. They initially had scoped a data collaboration that was looking at how do we improve climate approaches and policy in the City of London, which is notoriously a haven for pollution in its inner city. And they've done a number of steps and things that have been data driven to try to solve that problem. Well, when COVID hit, it was really fascinating because all that data that was collected for the purposes of climate proved to be really useful and interesting in looking at helping London examine its COVID activity and its COVID readiness. So for example, they looked at activity and movement and clusters of folks that were in particular neighborhoods in London, and they used that information, they shared that information with the London Authority to develop policy and decision-making around closures and practices and communications based upon that activity. And that's a perfect example of going into an initial data collaboration with one perspective or one focus, but the real value and benefit has sort of yet to reveal itself. And so I think like these collaborations, the type of initial collaborations that a lot of organizations are doing now, where they're just getting started with data collaboration, and internally folks are saying, well, okay, so like, why are we doing this, and why should we commit, and how much should we commit? I think the following proof points are things that we've picked up. There's definitely some proof points that we get around the value of collaboration, like I mentioned. Equally valid would be the learnings that an organization obtains around the pain and the pressure points of collaboration. It's almost like stress testing without having an actual stressor or occasion to do so. We use those observations at Microsoft to understand how to scale future data collaborations, either philanthropic ones or their business-focused ones. We use those observations to refine not just how we ingest and use data in a discrete fashion, but how can we create a function that enables us to be more planful about how we collect data and are able to reuse it for future data philanthropy, future data collaboration. And I think those are the learnings that allow us to understand our customers' challenges, our own challenges, and then like very long-term, it's very much like R&D in the early stages. Ultimately, the business case for an organization like Microsoft is it helps us build and architect solutions that help our customers overcome those challenges. And that's a good thing.
Great. Excellent. So Claudia, meaning being at a foundation and having, of course, long-standing experience in foundations as well, what we heard quite often at the beginning of the pandemic were several epidemiologists that we worked with who were very frustrated that in order to actually be able to do data collaboration, they had to fill in a long proposal and then have several review processes to get actually funding to deal with an emergency like COVID-19. So how can we make data collaboration also more sustainable from the funding point of view? Should there be some, anyway, different way of actually funding data initiatives? And if so, how?
Very good question. I've been part of a couple of attempts to pull off a data collaboration in the nonprofit space. One of the kind of the data collaborations, they actually signed after, I think, speaking for 2 years, a memorandum of understanding, 3 organizations. So Terre des Hommes, which is a child relief organization in Switzerland, World Vision, and Action Against Hunger. And basically what they wanted to collaborate on, one organization gathers data, has 5 million consultations with children under the age of 5 on preventable diseases, and the other one select data on nutritional status. And you can imagine both, are needed to get a full picture of a child and diagnose potential diseases. And funders have really not, even though I think the impact case is clear and has been clearly articulated, funders have shied away from this collaboration because they worry about the kind of the overhead and the kind of governance difficulties that such a collaboration would bring with it. And here we are talking about nonprofit to nonprofit data collaboration, so not even reaching out to the private sector, but clearly we are also talking about some of the most vulnerable populations on this planet and children at that. But when I think about the private sector, I think I have major questions around how to make this sustainable, because what I'm seeing, what often happens is at the nonprofit, somebody knows someone at the company. And I think that was what we heard consistently here on the panel. And that is why they might have an opportunity to benefit from that data philanthropy or find the right person. But data philanthropy, like financial philanthropy, is not sustainable. You need then another grant and another grant, and it's not something. It's often for a really time-bounded or for a bound period of time, and not something where you continuously want to iterate, improve the models and how you use the data. So I think the question, at the end of my comments that I'm wondering about is the infrastructure that we have in place, the right infrastructure, and can we use some of our current models really to deal with data? And I'm saying this, I'm aware I'm saying this as a European, but do we need data that companies just need to make available that serve a public purpose? And maybe there are different tiers to whom, or in the case of emergency, and are there then kind of other sets that are really continue to be proprietary and competition related? And what's the fair pricing around data that needs to be built into grants and grant funding? I think the kind of the expectation that data would be made available for free over long periods of time just doesn't seem fully realistic.
JoAnn, any reactions to what Claudia raised here? And yeah, there are a lot of conversations about, should we have a list of use cases that enable mandatory requests for certain kinds of data? And so any reactions from your end?
No, and there are many discussions going on. I think Claudia is touching on them, and Stefaan, I think you've been part of them too, of should there be data sets available for common purposes, right? So there's a World Economic Forum is looking at this very seriously. Should we as a society, global society, should we have certain types of data sets that are available with a common in-structure language and probably even a data structure, right? Back to some of the points that Kelly was making at the very beginning of her comments, right? To enable this to work well, we also have to make the data available for these emergent issues, right? So that it not only is the data available, but it has high utility. But we also have to respect the fact that organizations have also created value in the data, right? So there's this economic tension that has to also be respected. And then there's also the issues that I mentioned briefly, privacy and security, right? So, and how do we look at data? Because data, what I'm going to call flat data, right? So data elements, everybody tries to put a value on the data elements when it's really data in use or in context, that data has a certain amount of value, right? And that is one of the challenges of kind of this whole idea of having data made available. And so I think that it's becoming discussed, but I think we're a ways away from kind of that global utility. In the meantime, though, I do think that organizations are trying to work together on best practices for data sharing, so that it's easier to make it happen when the when issues arise and the need arises and the opportunities arise. Because I think we're very much influenced COVID in this discussion, but there's also opportunities to work together. And what is it that we need to create an ecosystem of what I will call data donors and data recipients, if we're talking about it in a common, you know, in a kind of, I don't want to say philanthropic. Philanthropic assumes some kind of donation, but if we want to make data available for improvement and inclusion, then how do we make that happen? And what are the tools that are necessary? And then really, what are the principles necessary that all parties are going to agree to? And that includes how are we really making it transparent to individuals who have provided their data to different enterprises, whether it be government, whether private enterprise, how their information is going to be used for these additional purposes. I think most members of society are fine with their data being used to solve COVID because we're all going to benefit because it's a common ill. But the minute you back away from something like that, then we get into other issues, right? That also have to be taken into consideration. So Claudia, I hear you, but having looked at this issue, as Stefaan has said, there's issues that to be addressed. But I agree that some kind of common ecosystem infrastructure is, I think there's a lot of discussions and I think we will get there. I do.
So you think, because anyway, we've been part of those conversations before COVID-19 to actually get that kind of common agreement so that when it would happen, something would happen, you would actually be ready. And so I think the big takeaway was we were not ready having, because we didn't have those common principles. And so you think now there is more sensitivity or at least more receptivity to actually working towards those common principles, because that would be interesting.
I do. I think that it's, I think, you know, we announced back in the fall of 2019, our data responsibility principles, which was an approach to basically saying that individuals should own their own data, right, and have right therein, but that organizations had to be accountable about how they use data, that they needed to be transparent, give individual control, but they also needed to commit to integrity in their data practices, innovate with data, and also use data for social impact, and have commensurate data practices. And that we invited other companies to come and develop these best practices with us. And we've really seen an uptick in the number of companies that have these type of principles and want to have best practice. Now, COVID's taken over the world, right? COVID and probably ethical AI are the two kind of topics that everybody's, you know, speaking about. I'm seeing David nod and others, right? And so with those twin engines, right, of commonality, I do think that we could get to some baseline best practices, but the challenge is, will those practices apply in the right context, right? Can we agree to the baseline that then can be leveraged and then specified in a pandemic context, right, which is kind of the emergency Claudia is talking about, right? To other contexts in healthcare, financial, communications, protection of children, right? I mean, there's a whole host of things, you know, that we could, I think, as society agree to. And then what gets to be kept, right, for that intellectual property that I think different organizations, all organizations have put into their data analytics and into, I don't know, the creation of value, right? That's a whole nother panel stuff. Right, that organizations have put into data, right, as an asset class that we haven't even yet begun to address as a society.
Great. I'm also sensitive to the questions in the chat, and Jan, feel free to also chime in and pose your question directly, but Kelly, there was a question from Jan with regard to more sensitive data that, which is anyway, a similar kind of challenge that of course the private sector has, because government has a lot of sensitive data, and how do you even go about determining, which it seems to be like what JoAnn was going to, is that how do we determine what's the appropriate use case to actually look into a broader access provisions for that data, and it doesn't have to automatically be sharing, right? So it could be a real conditional kind of functional access to data. And so what's the, anyway, how do you think about that within New York?
So for those of you following along or not following along, I had actually pasted the New York City Open Data website, nyc.gov/open data, one word. And we have over 2,000 data sets. I think we had counted at last count 3.3 billion rows of data on the website. So it's pretty significant how much information we have uploaded on there. And there shouldn't be any sensitive data uploaded. So with each of our agencies, they do work in partnership with their general counsels, with their agency privacy officers to review a lot of the information and assess for, should it be actually made public, or are there certain elements that we're restricting, or do we not make this data set public at all? We are very fortunate here in New York City. There is an open data law, local law 11 of 2012, that specifies that all city agencies, thank goodness, have to make public what should be public into one portal. You can imagine what it would have been like if everyone published information on all of their own individual agencies' websites. And I think this question of what are additional research areas, maybe that's starting to delve into more sensitive data, comes up pretty frequently. We get contacted by academic researchers all the time, and they say, hey, I would like to get access to this data. We are, as I mentioned earlier, a central hub and oftentimes a conduit to other agencies, but we send folks to those agencies. If you want to talk about education data, we'll send you to the education department. If you want to talk about transportation, we'll send you over to transportation. So it is oftentimes we are walking this line, and I'd love to hear from the other panelists as well, where we're pretty generalists about the data. We ourselves don't actually own the domains or the policy issue areas. And so we can only really be, at the end of the day, a very good steward, a very good shepherd of all of this information. But that tension, I think, continues to grow a little bit based off what I think both Dave and JoAnn were touching upon, where we have this tension, right, of like more people want more data about people, but here I am oftentimes concerned about what data is being gathered about me, especially in 2020, that whether or not it's raw or aggregate, I'm kind of worried about where that's going generally. And that's not just restricted to government, but private sector, any type of organization that's collecting my information. And I feel like in the last week, I'm on some like marketing spam email list. I'm just getting like a lot of vendors emailing me over the last week or two. So it is something we continue to grapple with. I will say the more folks that interact with the open data portal, and I think we touched upon this with value creation with data collaboratives or just generally, I think a lot about the power curve, both with the pandemic and generally. Like if you've stood up an environment, but you can't move quickly enough to deliver insights, whether that's open data or other places that you've stored and integrated data, you're going to completely miss the questions that come about. So I think about this speed question, which I know is very different from an academic type question of like, we may want to work on something for a couple years and deliver analysis, whereas much of my day-to-day is we need something today. Like I need something tonight at 8 p.m. There's a briefing that's happening, or we need something by tomorrow morning. So I think about that tension as well around the different customers of the data, how they all have very different timelines and timeframes, and what that means for when we're architecting the infrastructure.
May I jump in?
Yeah, please.
I was the one who asked the question.
Yeah.
Thanks. It was a good answer. And I thought of just extending it with some of the work that's being done in my data as the my
Yes.
data operator. If you see that the individual willing to give their data, donate for purpose of research and the general interest, if you see an opportunity to try to enable people to give their data for researchers with a clear purpose and not sharing it further down the road. And if that you could answer maybe the other panelists as well, I would be interested to hear. Thanks.
Kelly, you want to go first, or
I can very quickly go, but I've been talking, so I'll pass it over to the other panelists. I struggle with that question because I am hopeful that currently people are becoming more savvy, and I'm not sure, like, that bar of why are you receiving my data, why are you using that data, I think is starting to continue to increase over time. So I completely understand that. I think for most institutions, certainly government, it's like, oh, we're working with academia, we're used to this, we're used to sharing data with academia for research purposes more. But yeah, I don't know. I think for me that bar is continuing to be raised over time. Certainly when you think about the New Yorkers here and the types of individuals, again, could be in another panel session entirely. When we think about the folks who may be more prone because of lower levels of data literacy to give up their data or share their data because they don't quite understand, or they don't understand the value of their own information. Yeah, I think I still have a lot of questions there. But
great, Kelly, and thanks for combining it with the other question of Tatiana, which was about data literacy, and that's also the question I would like the other panelists to address, which is the question from JoAnn. To what extent is there an opportunity for individual agency to determine how their data is being used? And then to what extent is there need for increased data literacy to even enable that, but also to even understand and trust what is being done with data in general? And I think that's kind of a combination of questions that perhaps JoAnn, it seems like you're very eager to tackle and jump in, and then Claudia and Dave, feel free to contribute as well.
Okay, where do we start? Do you think that individuals are increasingly wanting to have control over their data and understand the purposes beyond the primary purpose for which they gave their data, if it's going to be used for other purposes? I think that is just
and I think JoAnn pushed also, because anyway, this is the My Data conference, and so My Data community has done a lot of work also on how then can individuals decide on how it is being used. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I do think that we will wind up in a place, there's been lots of conversation about data vault and data for data control panel, right? Where individuals at some point will really be able to have more agency over how they choose how their data is or is not used, right? And I do think that's a good thing. So when we talk about having an individual having more control, we envision that is the future that will go forward. Now, that does require greater data literacy so that individuals can make more choices about how their information is being used. I think also that the more organizations disclose both the primary and any secondary uses of data and give individuals choices about how that data is being used is also good data practice, and also engenders trust, which is also going to be really important if we ever want to get to the future that Claudia was describing of open data sets as well, right? We've done work with researchers where we've invited researchers into MasterCard to work alongside our data scientists on different topics of research. I have to be honest, we have to be careful that only to really do things where we think our data is going to be helpful, right? And then export only the insights to go on into any for research. So it does require, data research does require a fair deft hand in kind of exporting insights into the next level of data research, and then making sure that our participation has been described in a way that's going to be kind of coherent with our brand, our reputation, and what individuals might expect of MasterCard. So there are a lot of different issues here. I do think, though, that it will require a lot of data literacy, and then we get into the question of how have we created today? And right now there's an awful lot of it's a free market, right? That individuals do not understand what they are getting in exchange for their data, right? We have not done a good job of making that very transparent. So they do not understand the benefits of use, right? That is happening today, and that's part of the challenge and the paradigm that has to shift. And that is a pretty hard climb from a data literacy perspective, because I'm not sure that we have created the most trusted environment to start that conversation.
Great. Dave?
Well, look, there's a lot packed in there, and I rather than try to unpack it, I think I'll just give a couple of thoughts. From Microsoft's perspective, it is crucial and critical that users have transparency and that they have trust, that they trust and understand how their data is going to be used, and that they have choice in determining the context of where that occurs. And I think if organizations are going to do their best part to improve data literacy, I think one of the things they need to work on and continue to work on is having tool sets and having transparency that really gives users not just information, but kind of informed choice. Because I think most consumers, when confronted with that information and given an opportunity to dictate choice, they're less prone to suspicion, and so they're more prone to enable collaborations. The challenge that I see is there's often discussion about, well, we should limit data, we should limit research, for example, to certain actors, or we should limit it to certain activities. What I would say is, look, research in the 21st century is not as clean and clear. It's not these white ivory academic towers, and it's not purely corporate R&D. It's often a mixture of that. The examples I gave with the Turing Institute are perfect examples of that. And so, we're very sensitive, A, because we don't want to be shut out, but B, because we don't want to limit the kind of innovative R&D that occurs in the 21st century. So we've been having conversations with regulators about how to think about regulation in that context. A perfect example was in the text and data mining discussions that took place last year in Europe, as Europe crafted an exception to their copyright provisions around text and data mining. They initially were going to create and enable benefits that would only accrue to nonprofit, public interest research. And my first reaction was, who does that? Like, what is that anymore? Really good research will typically involve multiple parties in the private and public sector. And if it's really useful and beneficial research, there needs to be a commercialization component of it, so that the value of that innovation can be democratized and shared. And so, these are really challenging, difficult discussions. I think you're seeing examples of that discussions occur right now in the pending European data legislation, where there's very much a fear and a concern about that certain geographies or that certain actors within geographies may be unfairly enhanced if they have access to data at the expense of others. And again, I think having a deeper conversation and a more honest and intelligent conversation really requires that we provide lots of transparency, lots of information. Regulators often don't understand the typical details of how this technology works, how research happens, the kinds of examples. And I think once they do, oftentimes they'll go back and look at their regulations, their draft regulations, and go, okay, well, we didn't mean that, so let's refine that. So look, I would just say the best things that we've figured out in that space, and I don't mean to be sort of self-aggrandizing here, is we need to have broader discussions. We need to remove the mystery. And one of the ways to remove that mystery is to empower organizations that do have experience and have participated in this and have deep thoughts about data stewardship. That's why, Stefaan, after we spent a year or two watching the work that the GovLabs did, that we thought the best thing that we could do in this space is to give more resources and enable an open data policy lab to be created to have exactly those free and uninhibited discussions.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Dave, for that. And there's a lot of, in the chat, there's a lot of reference to the, of course, Data Governance Act, given the fact that we have a lot of European actors in the audience. And I will anyway feel free to react if you want. But before we go there, I do want to stay a little bit on the data literacy question because again, it comes back over and over again. And again, yesterday I was in a workshop and the solution to all the problems was more education, right? And so question to you, Claudia. Given the fact that we have, I don't know what the latest number is, 7 billion. How do we get data literacy at mass scale? Because that seems to be, given the fact that everyone ultimately is affected by data collection and sharing practices, how do we get that level of literacy anyway at a level that actually scales? Easy question for you, Claudia.
Yeah, I was about to say, I'm kind of, that's the $1 million question, or probably $10 million question that I'm solving now today. And I don't have an answer to that. I mean, my a little bit cynic response maybe is that I have a hard time imagining how you can, simplify something that is fairly complex and nuanced and granular at a level that can really, when you talk about real consent and real kind of understanding what data is being used for. I mean, even today, at least I'm clicking on when I get these notices. Do you accept? I click on them and say yes to get to the next page, and I feel a lot of people are probably doing that. And then I'm thinking about people in countries where there is no data regulation yet. And no national data strategy, and people who might not be literate to begin with. I mean, how do you deal with all of that? And so I don't know. I mean, clearly, more education from really kindergarten on is one thing. I mean, this needs to become part of life skills. How do we manage that? But also on the other hand, I'm wondering, and I think someone in the chat says it, are there intermediaries? So am I signing on to an intermediary that who I trust in a way like a bank, although I don't know if that's a good analogy in terms of trust, but someone who can and who then I agree with in terms of simple principles and who manages some of that for me. But I don't know if that's the solution. Tricky.
One of the elements that we in New York, as Kelly knows, have explored is the role of libraries in that the whole concept, because libraries turns out to be quite often some of the most trusted players around data, and they also have the credibility to understand the needs of their patrons with regard to that kind of data literacy kind of approach, and so that might be a way forward as well. And again, there are more detailed questions in the Slack about Article 108 of the Act. I'm sure, Dave, you might have memorized that, but perhaps a little bit more detail would be good, or Article 3 till 8 is even better. But I do want to, because I'm sensitive to the time as well, and we have like 7 minutes left, and I see that many of our European audiences are at the breaking point of acceptance here of more input. But I do want to get every one of you to think about, which is always the hardest question that I hate if I'm on a panel, but still think about if you would have a magic wand and you can do one thing with your magic wand in order to actually make data collaboration more systematic, sustainable, and responsible. What would be the one kind of priority that you feel if you get that right, the rest might follow? What would be the kind of intervention you would prioritize? Kelly, why don't we start with you?
Sure, and I'm going to piggyback directly off the data literacy and education discussion just now, which was, I feel pretty strongly that there's a lot of professional fields that have certifications, lawyers, doctors, engineers that should be baking in an understanding of data and data literacy into those professions. And so I can't tell you the number of times that, I've worked with lawyers, they advise on, data sharing agreements and work that we do. And it's so strange to me thinking of like, oh, like maybe folks don't fully understand what does tabular data look like? Like, what are we actually working with? What are some of the terms that we may be using? And Stefan, I'll cheat a little bit. My second sub bullet is I really want folks to banish the term I'm not a technical person, because I actually think it's everybody's job in 2020 and beyond to become a technical person and to understand and begin to understand how you bake a lot of this into your profession, into your day-to-day work.
Great. And we've been advocating also for bilinguals, which are people that have both those skills, and also, of course, data stewards, as Dave referred to, that actually does have the multiple skills to navigate. So it resonates a lot, Kelly. And JoAnn, you have a magic wand. What would you do with it?
I'm going to piggyback off of trust. I think that I'm with Kelly. I'm intrigued by the whole idea of literacy, data literacy for other professions, though. But I think if we do not build the ecosystem in a way that's trustworthy for all the constituents to understand each other's concerns, I think we will not get off the ground. And I think we have to start with the individual, and I think Dave did a really nice job with that. And I think there are ways to engage with individuals that we haven't done successfully. But I also think that, if you put the quadrant of all the actors, whether you put private sector and government actors and individuals and, I don't know, NGOs and academia and another, we still don't all understand each other's perspectives well in the ecosystem that we're trying to create.
Right.
And so we've got to build trust in the whole ecosystem for this truly get off the ground. And that does require Kelly's data literacy and the bilingualism that you're referring to, Stefan, that we need to understand each other's perspectives in order to build that trustworthiness to share that information and then move forward with solving the problems we're trying to solve.
Great. Dave?
Only one choice. So if the genie is
only one, I mean, the magic wand only allows you to make one intervention.
Maybe what I'll say is,
and if you use two, then Claudia won't have any left. So no pressure.
I would encourage organizations that are sitting on the sidelines, who are not entering into the discussion, or even more important, not collaborating and not entering into the collaboration ecosystem, to get off the sidelines, and that's going to require that they rethink the purpose and the value of data, and what they can achieve through collaboration. This has to be mainstream. We have to democratize this access to data, because a lot of that data, frankly, some of the world's most valuable data sits in a much smaller group of companies and corporations and entities and organizations. And without the ability to make it accessible, and without the ability to create the environment in which we can collaborate and share, we're never going to realize the value of that. And I think for companies like Microsoft, for example, and others, it really requires testing some of your presumptions or assumptions. Let's not treat data the same way that we would treat other intangible or digital assets, such as, in our case, code or intellectual property. I think that IP is a very poor fit for data. And I think the way to think about this is to actually look at the benefits and value beyond the fiscal benefits and value of collaboration with that asset. So that's what I would change.
Great. Claudia, magic wand.
Magic wand.
And also you have the magic wand and the last word. So there we go.
Oh, that is a high bar, but I feel I'm so yes to what Kelly said and JoAnn said, and maybe I'm just saying what Dave already said in other words, but I would wave my magic wand to bring transaction costs down And I think that requires moving from case by case, piecemeal, company by company, to kind of a broader framework, something that Stefaan, you are already working on, because ultimately I think much more work, especially from a nonprofit perspective, needs to be done to really fully understand the value of data collaborations in different contexts.
Wonderful, and great note to end on. And I think that was one of the big lessons, I guess, that we took from this whole conversation about data collaboration at the time of COVID-19, is that there's an increased understanding of the value proposition of data collaboration, but that indeed we need to work on a variety of bits and pieces, including also bringing in other actors in order to really bring down the transaction costs, increase the trust among all actors, including the public, and ultimately establish this in a way that it becomes the default, as opposed to a panel that is that features data collaboration at midnight in Europe, and that it actually becomes the front piece of how we go about this. And so thanks everyone for joining. Thanks Kelly, JoAnn, Dave, and Claudia for jumping in here and sharing your wisdom. I've learned a lot. And thanks to all the members of the audience, especially the ones from Europe, to join us at a very late moment. And I hope that we can move this conversation into indeed concrete actions. And I'm trust that the My Data community, which is a very hands-on community, will take some of those lessons learned and also turn it into real tools and actions moving forward. So thanks so much, and stay safe.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.